Hello and welcome. My name is Margit Bantowski. Welcome to All Hearts on Deck. I am a transformative coach and a Trillium Awakening teacher. Trillium Awakening is a spiritual path that integrates consciousness, embodiment, and mutuality or relatedness. And the topic today is the other, the social undercurrents of mutuality. So my All Hearts on Deck sittings and offerings are generally geared to what I call mature Trillium practitioners, people who've been in the work for quite a while and ideally have had their whole being realization. In Trillium, that's what we call awakening. It's the integration of the infinite and finite aspects of self and the unique and collective, the way in which the unity of all life is known in an embodied way. And part of the reason I have that as a context is because a lot of activism that happens before whole being realization can be energized through fear and anxiety of that comes from a separate self. Identity as a separate self. So there's something about relaxing in the unity of the whole and the recognition of non-separation that allows our system to relax and actually engage and respond to the world from a different place, more from compassion than from fear. And one of the things I love about Trillium is that we really take seriously this idea of mutuality. It's a key aspect of the awakening. We awaken in that non-separation, and that means that what I do to you, I do to myself. There's this visceral co-responsibility and webbed inness that we can no longer ignore. So mutuality actually kind of gets heightened after awakening. Many people experience more sensitivity. It's getting harder to watch the news because we're more impacted by what we sense around ourselves. And it can be beautiful, more open to the light shining through the orange and red maple leaves in my backyard, and then more sensitivity to how I impact others. And today's topic about the other, I'm focusing primarily on human others. There are other talks that I've done where we explore the ecological dimension of other, but this one is a social aspect of other. And the lens through which I want to look at impacting other and how we relate to other in a human dimension, the lens I want to take is a lens of trauma, looking through the lens of trauma. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about my own recognition of how my trauma, my personal, my biographical trauma has impacted or decreased my ability to be, to see and feel another person. And before doing that, I just want to name Thomas Hübl. He's a German spiritual teacher, brilliant and daring man who, in his spiritual work, recognized that there's collective trauma. He works in large groups of people, and that collective trauma would come up in those large groups to be healed. And the phrase that he uses that I find really potent in this conversation today is absencing. The absencing of seeing and the absencing of feeling. So when trauma is basically any event that's overwhelming to the young nervous system that we didn't have the support to process or integrate or metabolize. So when we don't have the support to handle an overwhelming event, that gets pushed down in our bodies and in our psyches, and we shield it so that we can continue to function. And it's a brilliant capacity, but at some point, that brilliant capacity to shield ourselves from the terror or grief or horror or whatever it was that was unbearable, at some point that shielding gets in the way of our ability to actually be with another person. It gets in the way of our ability to do mutuality. So paradoxically, being in mutuality is a doorway to activating the trauma so it can be healed, so that our awakening can deepen and we're more and more alive and unbound and more responsive to the world around us. So Thomas's beautiful phrase, absencing. So the trauma shuts us down, keeps us safe, but there's a numb pocket. And in that numb pocket, I actually may have difficulty relating to you in that vulnerable or that tender place. So I'm going to give you a couple examples on the personal level. So when I was little, I had a very powerful stepfather, British, and very dominating and shame-based parenting. And my vulnerability was completely untolerated. Like, vulnerability was unacceptable. You've got to be strong. You've got to be tough. Don't cry, and get over it and get on with it. And so, my mother being German, I was born in Germany, so her constellation was that same frame. So she's tough upper lip. They both endured horrible things in World War II. So my access to my vulnerability is diminished. It's a pocket. And in my marriage, I can be quite insensitive to my husband's vulnerability, quite impatient with him. Like, if we're going on a hike and he's getting a little blister on his foot, I'm just like, that's so annoying. Your blister is so annoying. Just stop complaining and hike, march. So that's one example of how my own trauma makes it an absence of seeing and feeling his suffering. There's another pocket that I have around grief. So I was born in an orphanage. It was 6 months before my mother was in the space. She was very young before she could take me home. I also lost my father when I was 5. And so there's a way that I don't have, I'm shielded around grief and loss. And I noticed this when when my stepfather died, and I did love my stepfather very much, as verbally abusive as he was. There's ways in which we got along really well, and I adored him. And when my stepfather died, I couldn't cry, and my brother had access to tears. And that happens, it's multiple ways. When I break up with someone, I don't have access to a lot of grief. And one way that it showed up is when I heard about the border crossings and how children were being separated from their parents. And there's a numb spot. There's an absence of seeing and feeling that suffering because I don't necessarily have access or haven't fully healed the trauma of being that deeply abandoned myself. So those are 2 examples of my personal biography and trauma and how that affects my ability to relate to my husband, but then how it affects my ability to relate to a group of people, the people coming who are immigrating and were separated, parents and children were separated. So I'm going to invite you now to do a little journal writing. And to do that, I'll do a screen share. what are some of your personal blind spots? In other words, what do you not want to see or feel or bear when you're with another person? So, for example, I don't want to bear or hear my husband's tenderness. I'm getting better. Don't worry. We're doing a lot better. But just as an example. And see if you can notice some on a personal level, some patterns on a personal level, and then also on the collective level. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that. And I'm going to, if you're watching this as a recording, you may want to push pause so that you can give yourself some time. Another way to notice your blind spot is notice what you get impatient with. What do you get really impatient with? What do you say, get over it, or where do you minimize someone else's suffering? Again, experimenting with how the personal relates to the collective. Okay, slowly wrap up that thought. And stop the screen share. So, sometimes I just want to acknowledge that some of us are very sensitive to other people's suffering. And sometimes the trauma can actually sensitize us. So there's sort of there can be a numbness, which we just explored, but there can also be a heightened sensitivity. And sometimes that heightened sensitivity can be a projection, and that can mobilize our activism, right? So I just want to name that possibility. But for now, the main inquiry is numbness and absencing for this today. But I just want to make a placeholder for the way in which sometimes trauma can actually hypersensitize us to particular types of suffering. So one of the books that I'm working through right now that I'm finding very powerful is called My Grandmother's Hands. It is written by Resmaa Menakem, who is a therapist in Minnesota. The book subtitle is Racialized Trauma and the Pathways to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. And what I love about this work is the lens of trauma and how our responses to certain groups of people is pre-conscious. It's not something we necessarily do cognitively. It's something our bodies do. And of course, in this book, it's in the channel of racism. It's looking specifically at how trauma affects our relationships with, for white bodies, our relationship to black and brown bodies from a very embodied perspective. So one of the things he talks about is how white people, white bodies, have a pretty brutal history. And it goes back a long ways. You know, one of my other All Hearts on Deck inquiries is around the feminine and what happened when goddess-centered cultures were overcome by masculine dominating cultures, where the power to take life became the power that was recognized, valued, and sort of dominated our cultural structures for at least 5,000 years now. So in that long history of brutality and dominance, what happened to our bodies? So what I want to do is show some photos and drawings of what the white European body, what our ancestors lived. And there's data now that show that trauma is epigenetic, like it goes into our bodies. So the trauma from our ancestors gets propagated through our DNA down to us. So I want, as I show you these pictures, I want you to imagine what's happening to the white bodies in this picture. So here, this looks like a child. There's a man, looks like a man with a smaller person on their back. So there's this child watching a public beheading. Here's a woman and man, and they're just kind of chatting away, and these people are chatting. Here's another smaller person. So what is happening in the bodies that are witnessing this public brutality, which was commonplace? Just because it's normal doesn't mean it isn't traumatic and it isn't brutal. And what's happening in your body as you look at this image? Are you blank? Or is there activation? Is there fear? Where's the impulse to step in and stop the brutality? Is it there at all? Or is this business as usual? Are we just, chatting along on the outside? This is part of my experience of watching television. We're in the TV room, I'm chatting with someone, and meanwhile, all these horrific pictures come up. And I'm not necessarily paying much attention. It's sort of a neutral, numb experience. Here is a more vivid hanging. And so this is hung, drawn, and quartered. This is a very common practice for traders in England, and it began in the 1300s and was finally abolished in the late 1800s. And they would hung, drawn, and quartered. So first they'd draw someone behind a horse for however long in public view, then hang them but not quite kill them, and then gut them in public and eventually kill them, and then burn them or quarter them and put their body parts on display. So what is it like? Here are people just chit-chatting, and there's no expression of horror on their faces. There's a smile here, there's a smile here. They're just kind of chatting, they're pointing. There's no display of horror or trauma. What does it take for a white body for this to be normal, right? So this is what our white ancestors. So I just wanted to show these two pictures. The first one having some children in it. This one mostly one, but the first one had children and women. I'm going to show another picture. And what's similar about this picture, right? You've got some young people here, right? They're barely teenagers. There's an old person, there's women, there's a man. This guy's smiling. It's a social moment of a lynching. And this wasn't that long ago, right? It's the early 1900s. There's another one here with men. Some are smiling. So I want to invite us to consider what our white ancestral bodies have passed down to us, what's in our bodies now and psyches, and what are the absences of seeing and feeling that might have been created by a culture where these sorts of horrors were normal. So the hung, drawn, and quartered was finally abolished in 1870 in England. And the death penalty for treason was finally abolished in 1998 in England. Right? So Europeans, and not just Europeans, but cultures all over the world, and I'm just speaking from a white woman's perspective here, we've murdered, butchered, tortured, abused, conquered, enslaved, oppressed, and colonized, and burned one another for thousands of years before directing that to black bodies in America, also female bodies for being witches. So the next question for contemplation, let me get that one up. The next question for contemplation is list at least 5 cultural collective blind spots. Given this backdrop and your sense of Western industrialized culture, list at least 5 cultural blind spots. And if you're watching this on a video, you can push pause for a moment and give yourself time to make your list. And wrapping up that thought, you can come back to it later. There will be more as we start seeing more. You can continue the list. And I just want to acknowledge that I just showed you some photos and images that are really hard to take in. The first image of the lynching is actually a postcard. We printed postcards of lynching. So there's some sort of distance there that would allow us to put that image and sell it as some sort of thing, an image that you would send to a family member or a friend. So just take a moment and nurture yourself in whatever way you need to as you take in that fact. Maybe giving yourself some compassion or extending compassion to the whole human situation. Maybe rocking your body gently. Some deep breaths, regulating yourself. And if you don't feel the need to regulate, just notice that you weren't particularly activated by the images. That's worth noting as well. So, cultural blind spots can include certain emotions or expressions that are, taboo within a cultural frame. And then there's certain populations. So I left that question intentionally open. What are some of our cultural blind spots where there's an absence of seeing and feeling? So that there could be general qualities and also specific groups of people. So I'm just going to share another screen with you that has a more explicit list that can be helpful to look at. So this list of categories of people in our culture that are systemically disadvantaged and marginalized and systemically advantaged or given benefit. So there's age. What are our absences of seeing and feeling around age? Adults versus children, adolescents, and elders. So you can make a note if you wish of the ones that you left out. Disability. What is our absence, cultural absences of feeling and seeing around disability? Religion or religious culture. Absences of seeing and feeling around non-Christian culture. Ethnicity. Absences of seeing and feeling around non-white people of color. That's the one we just explored a little more explicitly in those photographs. Social class culture. Sexual orientation. Indigenous ancestry. Were you born here or not? I mean, national origin is, are you born here or not? Indigenous, are you traditional indigenous people? And then gender. So even though these categories, if you drill down, they break apart because there is no such thing as race, really. Effectively, these groups of people experience significant absences of seeing and feeling. The consequence of those absences. Just want to point out that this addressing, that's the acronym, is created by Pamela Hayes. She's a psychotherapist. I have been working with this table, with this list, for over 20 years in the context of anti-oppression work by Dr. Leticia Nieto. I have an interview with Dr. Nieto on my website. But the point I'm making is that even though I've been working with this list for 20 years, for the session today, for this presentation, I had to, again, look it up and go through the acronym because the absencing in me is so pervasive that it's so easy for me to forget one of these categories, right? So just notice if there's any shame around that for you, and noticing that that shame is part of the trauma, part of the conditioning, and holds it in place, holds that distance, the absencing, the not wanting to see and feel. It holds it in place. So a third question for you now is, let's see, let me get the question queued up for you. Here's the third question. List 3 ways that you can become more conscious of your unconscious absencing, either as an individual or as a collective. So just take some time considering different ways, at least 3 ways, that we can become more conscious of our unconscious absencing, because it's so automatic. And if it's automatic, then we might need some nudges to get there. So how might we become more conscious of the absencing, either as individuals or as collectives, as a collective? And for those of you watching, you can give yourself time by pausing the recording. Okay, finishing up that thought. And then the fourth and final journaling question I have for you is list 3, well, they kind of go together. List 3 ways that you can heal cultural pockets of trauma And we'll just do it in yourself, in the collective. Again, the question is, list 3 ways how you might heal cultural pockets of trauma in yourself, and then list 3 ways of how you might heal cultural pockets of trauma in the collective. And of course, obviously, becoming conscious, the question you just worked on, that's the first step. But after you become conscious, what's the next steps? If you want to give yourself time and you're watching the video, just push pause. And wrapping up that thought. So, in conclusion, there's many, many different things that we can do to become more aware of our absences of feeling and seeing, both in ourselves and in a group of people, in our collective. I'm sure you came up with lots of, really good ideas. A few I might offer was, first, we need to do our own trauma work. For example, I need to access and heal the trauma around vulnerability in myself before I can extend my seeing and feeling to my husband, for example, and before I can respond to him with kindness and appropriately. So doing our own trauma work. I need to do my abandonment work so that I can feel and see the trauma of having parents and children separated at a border. And before I can actually respond, I need to see and feel. So doing our own work, feeling and seeing and knowing what it is that we have shut down in ourselves is a big doorway to having that capacity to be whole and to be responsive, to be able to respond to the world around us. So this awakening doesn't happen in a vacuum. We awaken in a collective situation. And what does it mean to have an awakened heart and to do awakened action? So healing that trauma in ourselves allows us to respond in a way that we would hope people would respond to us when we're suffering, right? Regulating ourselves. So it's not about blasting our nervous system with all the information out there on the horrors of the world. Yes, learning about and becoming aware and conscious about these suffering and all those 9 channels and more, right? Age, disability, religion, gender, sexual orientation, all of that, indigenous and ethnicity. So learning about the reality of that suffering is really important, and regulating ourselves around it, self-care. So becoming a martyr isn't really going to help anybody. So what does it mean to heal in a way that we can integrate? What's our pace? What's your pace? What's the rate at which you're able to do the healing? And then support. Can't do this without support. So for example, this Grandmother's Handbook on racialized trauma for white bodies, I'm in a support group for a year, and we're going through the embodied practices and learning information and integrating it and becoming aware of it in our bodies and talking about it together in a safe environment. So those are just a handful of ways that we can move forward. I think our souls are healed when we take action. So what kind of action comes out of this so that we can be in integrity? I think healing from trauma also involves being in integrity with ourselves and with others. So in conclusion, I want to offer a poem This is by Alfred or Fred Lamott. Beautiful book called The Fire of Darkness. He doesn't know it, but he's a Trillium poet. And just to also say, it's not about being perfect and doing it perfectly. So in healing, may we be really generous with ourselves and with each other. Here's the poem. Please blunder. Make mistakes. In your lattice work of fractures, you look more whole and beautiful. A trellis of cracks on the mirror gives intricate wings to your reflection. One appears as many there, because we dare to stumble and drop the crystal trinkets of ourselves. Surely love grows vines on the arbor of your shattering, and you make burgundy of sorrow. That is why you listen to the song of those who have been crushed. The secret is to soften your gaze until the splay of your fault lines takes the shape of a dahlia. How falling becomes you. When you have been torn beyond wholeness, the breath that was too faint to take comes home to heal you. May we all be healed and have the courage to do so. Look forward to seeing and being with you again soon. Bye for now. Oops. I don't want to end the meeting. I just want to stop the recording. There we go.